marriage, it's not worth it. It's not worth the practical and financial sacrifices, the lost romantic and sexual opportunities, and the lack of freedom. This is the message I got from Craig, a 29-year-old guy who came across a lecture of mine on men and marriage on the internet. In his words, I'd much rather buy a $75,000 condo by the beach with plenty of time to relax at the beach, sail, play golf and tennis, as well as hang out with my friends, rather than marry a 30-year-old woman and take care of her into old age. They're working 50 hours a week at a job I don't like. Craig also stressed he's in excellent physical condition because he doesn't have to work the kind of 9 to 5 hours that married men do. In his words, the fact is my six-pack abs have gotten me far more sex with high-quality women than a man's six-figure income ever will. The sex is passionate and does not require me to beg for sex like married men often have to do, because women are attracted to me physically rather than just interested in my ability to provide. Let's call him Six-Pack Craig. And his bill of particulars with marriage is long, as you can tell, a bit extreme. But I think that he does a good job of articulating a view of marriage that is more and more common today among younger men. The view, of course, is that marriage is a ball and chain of little value to the average guy, especially the kind of guy who lives kind of in the moment and according to the pleasure principle. Now, Six-Pack Craig is right about one thing, actually two things. Since getting married, I've definitely lost my six-pack abs. And yes, it's true that marriage requires sacrifices, lots of them. After you get married, you've got to work harder. You've got to steer clear of attractive alternatives. You've got to spend less time with your buddies. You've got to make a good faith effort day in and day out to be emotionally engaged in your marriage. Most guys find these sacrifices hard. But if you think about it, every good thing in life requires sacrifice. Think about your own life. Raise your hand if you've ever played a varsity sport, raised 3 kids, climbed a 14er in Colorado, or written a book. You know that all good things in life require sacrifice. And of course, Craig really is no different in this regard. He's willing to sacrifice for some things. In his case, a good body and the sexual variety that it affords him. So the point then, of course, is this. Our greatest accomplishments in life usually depend upon sacrifice. Marriage is no different. But the question that men like Six-Pack Craig have is, what is the marital ROI, return on investment? Is marriage worth the sacrifices that it requires of men? And contrary to the conventional wisdom that marriage is just a ball and chain, what we see in the research is that marriage offers significant returns for men when it comes to money, sex, and health. I'm talking to you here today about men because men are the ones who are less committed in unmarried relationships, and men are the ones who are less interested in marriage. They're the ones who need to hear this message the most today. And I think that America's religious institutions, because they have a language for words like commitment, fidelity, and sacrifice, are uniquely equipped to give this message to men. Both to unmarried men who might be thinking about or considering marriage, and to married men who need to be encouraged to stay the course. So first, let's talk about money. And consider the case of Doug Talby, a 37-year-old man from southern Ohio. When he was young, Doug was content to work a job paying close to minimum wage at a factory, and to live in his parents' basement. I really didn't have a care in the world, he told me. I didn't really have any bills. But after getting married and having kids, his perspective changed. I had to step up and think about something besides myself and start taking care of them. And so Doug joined the Army, where he had access to free health care and free housing for his family, set regular opportunities for promotion in a desire to sort of give his family a better financial footing. And then more recently, Doug has actually left the military is now working at a car dealership as a finance manager so as to further boost his family's income. Doug is now pulling in 6 figures. And his experience is emblematic of the way in which marriage transforms men. After getting married, men work harder, they work smarter, and they work more successfully. We know that married men work about 400 hours more per year than their single peers. We know that married men are less likely to be fired than their single peers. And because of all this, we know that married men make about $16,000 more per year than their single peers from roughly similar backgrounds. This is what scholars call men's marriage premium. Now, of course, it is true that in the short term, a lot of guys' money goes to their wife and kids. But over the longer term, married men are in better financial shape than their single peers. That's because, of course, they are making more money, they are saving more money, and also today they're often pooling their income with their wives. So as they approach retirement, for instance, married guys in their 50s have about 3 times the assets as do their single peers, about $150,000 compared to $47,000. So, my message to the six-pack Craigs of the world is this: the financial ROI on marriage is substantial. Married men typically have a lot more money in retirement than their single peers. It's worth the commitment, the fidelity, and the sacrifice. 2, let's talk about sex. So, money matters, but I think for many guys, sex matters more. And the question is married sex as passionless and pathetic as six-pack Craig contends? Now, it is true that when it comes to sort of the frequency of sex, we see that cohabiting guys have more sex than married guys. So data from the General Social Survey tells us that 52% of cohabiting guys in their 20s and 30s have sex twice a week or more, compared to 42% of married guys and just 37% of single guys. But when you turn and focus on the quality of sex, the story is different. Turns out that married sex trumps unmarried sex when it comes to the quality of sex. So the Chicago Sex Survey tells us that 51% of married guys say they are extremely satisfied with the emotional quality of their sex, compared to 39% of cohabiting guys and 36% of single guys. That same survey tells us that a majority of married guys say that they are extremely satisfied with the physical quality of sex, compared to a minority of unmarried guys. Now, these findings, I think, run counter to about every movie, sitcom, and music video that I have seen, right? So what's going on here? Well, I think that married guys benefit from the sense of security and trust they get from marriage in the sexual arena, and from the mutual investments that marriage encourages when it comes to sex. So one middle-aged spouse put it like this to 2 researchers: I think for sex, you need more time. Time to get in sync, time to know your partner, time to get to know what the other person likes and doesn't like. So, contrary to the idea or to the conventional wisdom that married sex is passionless and pathetic, what we see in the real world is that there's a kind of depth and richness to married sex that you don't find in the alternatives. So, my message to the six-pack Craigs of the world is this: the sexual ROI on marriage is substantial. Married men typically enjoy better sex than their single peers. It's worth the commitment, the fidelity, and the sacrifice. 3rd, let's talk about health. And generally speaking, married guys are in better health than their single peers. Now, there's one actually important exception to this general pattern. And if you've been thinking about my talk, you may be guessing what I'm going to say. But we know on average that married guys tend to be a little bit heavier than their single peers. Okay. But otherwise, married men are doing better in the health department. We know, for instance, that married guys live about 10 years longer than their single peers. A recent study from Harvard found that among guys who were diagnosed with cancer, It was the married guys who lived significantly longer in the wake of that diagnosis. So what gives? Well, I think the companionship and the support and even the nagging that men get in marriage translate into better health. We know that our immune systems function better when we have support from loved ones. We know that wives tend to be advocates for their husbands with doctors and nurses when they're in the hospital, ensuring that they get better care in the hospital. And we know, too, that guys tend to get encouragement from their wives to see a doctor on a regular basis. Okay? So her nagging, in this case, can translate into his better health. Guys also benefit on the emotional front when they're married. Married men are less likely to be depressed. They're more likely to be happy when they're married compared to their unmarried peers. So we see, for instance, in data from the General Social Survey, that married guys in their 20s and 30s are half as likely to say that they're not happy in life. And they're more than twice as likely to say that they're very happy in life. 44% of guys who are married in their 20s and 30s say they're very happy, compared to just 20% of guys in their 20s and 30s who are not married. Okay? So marriage is clearly linked to better emotional outcomes for men. But this is not to say that life is simply happily ever after for guys after the wedding day. I think anyone here who has been married knows that there are many difficult days in married life. Real relationships with imperfect people are hard. Marriage is hard. But having a companion for the journey, I think, helps men navigate life. As one middle-aged man put it in the book, Staying the Course, if I wasn't married, I'd probably have one hell of a time. Probably spend my summers in Newport and my winters on the Caribbean. Then he went on to say, much as I wouldn't want to admit it, I'd probably be lonesome with life. Because I know quite a few guys that got divorced. A lot of them go home at night to a cold home. So he has sort of basically given up the privilege of spending the summers in Newport for the privilege of returning home at night to a warm home. So, my message to six-pack Craigs of the world is this. The health ROI on marriage is substantial. Married men typically enjoy better physical and mental health than their single peers. It's worth the commitment, the fidelity, and the sacrifice. Now, the science tells us that married men typically enjoy more money, better sex, and a longer life compared to their single peers. But, today marriage is not without its risks. And foremost among them is the risk of divorce. About 42% of first marriages will end in divorce. Most of those divorces are initiated by women. So there are obviously a number of guys out there in our society who are unwillingly divorced. And for them, they're not reaping much of a return on their investments in marriage. I think it's important just to note here that there are a few things that guys can do to reduce the risk of divorce. We know that guys who are stably employed, that guys who steer clear of drugs and alcohol, the guys who are sexually faithful, the guys who attend church regularly with their wife, the guys who make a good faith effort to be emotionally engaged in their marriages, to be affectionate, to be attentive, to be appreciative, are less likely to end up divorced. So all you married men out there, pay attention. Taking steps like these can reduce your risk of ending up in divorce court. So we've seen today that for the average guy, marriage offers a significant ROI, return on investment, when it comes to money, sex, and health. This is all a piece of what one major research study on men, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, found out about what makes men healthy and happy over the course of their lives. And this study was tracking men from early adulthood into their 70s and 80s. The director of that study, Dr. Robert Waldinger, summed up his results in this way. Over and over in these 75 years, our study has shown that people who fared the best were the people who leaned into relationships with family, with friends, and with community. This study reminded me of my grandfather and my namesake, Brad Hastings. He leaned into his marriage. He leaned into his parenting role. He leaned into his community, the spirit of faithful service, and shared with them his wise conversation, wry humor, and the occasional baritone singing. And it showed. Brad was a much beloved husband, father, and grandfather. But in his 70s, his body began to waste away as Lou Gehrig's disease attacked first his arms and then his respiratory system. And Six-Pack Craig might be interested to learn that as my grandfather was dying, he had a six-pack of sorts. He was pretty thin at the end. And he had the admiration of many women at the end. His wife, his daughters, and his 5 granddaughters. But their admiration for him had nothing to do with his body and everything to do with the spirit of faithful service that he had lived for his family and for his friends. So he enjoyed the evident admiration of 3 generations in his final chapter. This was kind of the ultimate return, of course, on his investments in marriage and family life. This is the kind of story that pastors, priests, and rabbis, not to mention ordinary lay people, need to share the Six-Pack Craigs of the world, both in and outside of the pews. The takeaway here is this. When it comes to love and marriage, a life lived for momentary pleasure does not compare to a life lived on behalf of those you love. So guys, man up. It's worth the commitment, the fidelity, and the sacrifice. In the end, you just might be fortunate enough to live a life as rich as my grandfather's. Thank you.
Now, you shared that you were focusing on men because today they're the most likely to be skeptical about marriage, and that's definitely something we want to hear. But we obviously are equally concerned about women and their well-being as creatures created with equal dignity and
right.
Who have leadership roles to play. So I wonder if you could also share with us from your research, what should we know about marriage and women's flourishing?
That's a great question, Greg, and I would say that we should be aware of the fact that in some important respects, I think that men benefit a bit more from marriage than do women. But women also benefit from marriage on average. We know that women also are in better financial shape, they're in better emotional shape on average, and they're also in better shape when it comes to their health if they're married as compared to being single. And I would also say that there's a kind of way in which you can kind of argue today that you can even make kind of a feminist case for marriage. And I would make really 2 points in this regard. Number one is that girls who come from intact marriages are today more likely to be flourishing in school and to be flourishing in the labor force as young women, okay? So having an involved and engaged father in the picture encourages girls to flourish both in the academic arena and then later on in the labor force. So that's point number one. And then point number two is that today there is no marriage penalty for women who are married. And in fact, what it looks like is that the motherhood penalty when it comes to being in the labor force for women is actually lower for married women than it is for unmarried women. That's, I think, because today many men are obviously helping their wives, if they are in the labor force, juggle work and family. So, the important, I think, takeaway here simply is that marriage offers a lot of benefits, not just to men, like I've been talking about this morning, but also to women. But they are somewhat different kinds of benefits, at times.
Thank you so much.